right, thank you for attending January's Listen and Learn session. We appreciate everyone coming. Just so that you are aware, we are videotaping this as well, and we will also be videotaping our 5:30 session as well. So we have a pretty straightforward agenda for today, but I did want to remind everyone the purpose of these, and that's for all of us to engage in listening and learning. And so what we've done on our previous Listen and Learn sessions is we've provided some education and updates of what we're doing on our end, but then also we have an opportunity for questions where we can listen and learn from the questions that you may have. So unique to this one was something that we just started using, and that was thought exchange. And so last week we sent out to all parents and all staff a link that they could go on and they could submit thoughts. And so the rest of our agenda from our table up here is all based on the questions that we received from that thought exchange. And we found it to be a very valuable tool because we thought, well, this is for us to listen and learn as well. And so we wanted to really get a sense of what our community, what our parents, what our teachers wanted to talk about. Going through all of that, we actually had a moment where we reflected on a lot of the questions, and we realized that some of the thoughts that we had were very staff specific, while others lended themselves more towards parents in the community. And we've always envisioned these types of sessions centered towards our parents and our community. And so we are now going to start looking at, well, how can we engage our staff as well? And similar questions, because I think the topics, although there is some crossover, don't always apply to the same audience. And so we're going to start looking at that as well. So the topics that we will be going through today with Superintendent Reisner, Dr. Jeff Hawkins, Dr. Anthony Jones, and Dr. Chad Dumas will be focused on ones that we saw that the community and parents could benefit from. So, with that said, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm Superintendent Reisner, for those of you that don't know me, and so thanks for taking your lunch hour to come and join us today. We really appreciate it. So like Eric said, the Thought Exchange tool gives us a really good look at what are the most important topics that rise to the top for our parents and our community. And so today, the approach that we're going to take is we've broken those down into topic areas that relate to the work that all of us are doing. And then we'll just kind of go through and answer exactly the questions that rose to the top, maybe 10, I think, ish. And so two of the things that I hope to address today are up there, and that's teacher retention and panorama survey. So the teacher retention this year, what we are doing, we have a new human resource director, lots of experience. She's also an attorney. So she has practiced civil law, and so it lends itself to a different lens than we've had before. She has begun doing exit surveys with all of our staff, and those will be done electronically unless a staff member would like to come in and meet. Typically, we've found that staff that are leaving us, oftentimes we can't get them to come in, and so without that online tool, we're kind of left to think, why did they leave, and not really know the reason for that. So this gives them a little more safety in answering that survey and maybe not having to be face-to-face with somebody from the district. But again, we'd also welcome that face-to-face meeting if they would like. The other key part is the panorama survey. So that is the survey that you all took, I want to say it was last spring, early spring, I believe. And it's taken us kind of this long to figure out what is our process going to be, because we need to not only give these surveys, but we need to make them part of our practice and analyzing, looking at them, and sharing the results, as well as building them into our planning process for school improvement plans. So in doing that, we we've gotten a process this year. So next year, we're going to give this again, and then next year, it'll be a much more rapid release of information. We're going to be able to use it in our building of our school improvement plans, and then get that information out to public at a much quicker pace. So I think we've gone through a really good process of sharing it with staff, and then we're now in the process of how this will be shared with the community. So on, I believe it's January 24th, that information will be sent out to the buildings. So by the buildings to the parents. Sorry, that was a little confusing. So you will receive your building's panorama survey information for your building. If you have kids that are in multiple buildings, you'll get it for multiple buildings. But one of the things that we really know from the research is that parents want to know about their building, what's going on in our building. So that's what we're really trying to work with, is how we improve that communication from parents to building administrators or parents to teachers, and that will give us that mechanism for measuring how well we're doing with that flow of information. So January 24th, you should look for that information. I know there is a process that our administrators are going through on how they're going to share that information, but you'll get the results at that point. So we're going to move on to the next set of topics, and we'll have Dr. Anthony Jones come up. For those of you that don't know, Anthony is our Director of Equity this year, and he's helping us look at all of our practices and policies through a critical lens for equity.
Good afternoon, everyone. And as Superintendent Reisman said, thank you all for being here today. I just want to give you some quick updates that we are working on within our district. And Eric, if you can go, I did add something to the slide. So I did put a list of things that we are currently working on. And so if you can just take a moment to glance at that, and I'll pull out some things to highlight. Okay, so as you can see with some of the things that we have happening within the district, the implicit bias training is a direct response to the equity audit that we just received at the beginning of this year, and so that will be happening at the high school. One of the things I do want to highlight is the Black and Black documentary. We have that happening at the end of February. The Black and Black documentary is something that was recommended by our African club at the high school, made up of students of African American descent, and they began to have some really deep discussions about the stereotypes and misconceptions between Africans and African Americans. And so there's this guy who produced a documentary exactly on that topic, and he's going around nationally and leading discussions around this documentary. And so he's going to come to Ames, and he's going to lead that discussion with our students at the high school. And then also we partner with the public library here, and we'll host that for the community on that Saturday. And so we'll make sure that we continue to get that information out to you if you're interested in attending that event on Saturday. I want to also highlight our ESL team. They worked really hard making sure that our ESL, our EL families in the district have interpreters and translators. And so one of the things that they've developed is a handbook for the interpreters and translators that we hire for the district, as well as we've created a guideline to be able to share with our teachers and our administrators within our district. So when they hire or reserve space for interpreters and translators for our families, we're all going by a particular guideline. And so we have developed that for the district. I'm also excited that we're also hosting on January 25th interpreters and translators training. And so just because, which is, a new learning for me, just because you do know how to speak a different language, there are certain skill sets that you need to have when you are an interpreter. And so, like, where do you sit in the room, and making sure that parents know to speak to the teacher and the teacher knows to speak to the parent and not to the interpreter. So those are like little specific skill sets that I had no idea. And so we're going to be working with our interpreters and translators with that with that training. We are with the equity priority in our district. One of the things I do want to highlight is it's not a pretty work, so it's not all about events and activities. So I put an asterisk by the equity problem solving process, because we are really trying to get into the habit of asking ourselves these tough questions before we make decisions. And one of the questions that I want to highlight is that question, I think I mentioned this the first time that we met, is that who is not benefiting from a decision or a policy that we're creating? And so we are pausing and asking ourselves those tough questions. And so I can only speak for myself. In past habits, we just do an event or, write a goal or something and not even consider, okay, so who is not benefiting from this goal? And so when you pause to ask yourself these tough questions, it takes more time. And so things don't happen as fast as you would like it to happen, because now you're really having some thinking, some deep, you're really drilling down in your thought process when you make a decision. And so those are not like the fun, exciting event things when you think about equity and what are you doing, but we are really taking our time to make sure that if we are no longer here, that we're doing things that will be long-lasting and that will affect the lives of all of our students and families in a positive way. One of the things that I also want to highlight, there was a question that came up about expanding critical consciousness to the community. And so I want to just throw out this plug. If you're interested in helping to plan this event, please reach out to me. I think it's more authentic when we do something in an event with the community, that we have community members at the table. We no longer want to assume what you want and what you want that to look like. So I'm inviting you, if you are interested in helping to plan what that will look like, please send me an email. I'll say this finally. I have to be able to, I want to highlight a question that was sent. And one of the questions, and maybe some of you who are here have this question, or those of you that may be watching it through recording online, why is the school district focusing on diversity and racism rather than focusing on the primary issues of why kids do not succeed, which is poor parenting? And so I don't know if, that may be a question that you may have, but two things that I do want to address with the short amount of time that I have is, one is that we've always talked about the bad issues outside of school. We've always talked about that, students who are poor, those kids from that community, or, we had that family last year, and so look out for this family. We've always talked about the outside factors. And what we've noticed is that nothing changed. Students were still failing, students were still having issues, even when we provided a homeless liaison, even when we provided social workers, even when we provided outside resources to be able to help and support our families. We've never really address issues that are happening within the school. Another thing, too, is that because we have students in our building with good parents who are also failing in our schools. And what I mean by failing, I'm talking about not just academically, doing well academically, but I'm talking about the experiences that they're having in school. And so I can only speak for my own family. I have 3 kids currently now in the school system. My sophomore is constantly talking to us about, can she be homeschooled? And my oldest, who is now a sophomore at Iowa State, doesn't even want to step foot on the campus of Ames High. She, as a matter of fact, she actually came to address the school board her junior year, asking them to address issues about how students who look like her, the things that they are experiencing in school. She's at Iowa State. She's doing well. 2 parents at home with academic achievements, and the experience here has affected her. So when you go back and ask that question, why is the school district focusing on diversity and racism? It's because race matters. We have to talk about the issues of our diverse students, our people of color, our students of color, and their experiences in this district. So we're going to continue to press that issue. I think once we begin to really jump on board and begin to deal with our own biases, our prejudices, those areas that we do are complicit in racist policies and practices, until we begin to call those things out and call you in and begin to make changes individually and systemically, then we will truly be the Ames School District that we oftentimes get recognized for locally, statewide, and nationally. So again, if you have any questions, please send them my way. I have a great team, great administrative team that we're working with, and so it's going to take all of us to really begin to see changes in our district. So again, thank you.
And I will plug our April focused Listen and Learn session will be all about equity. So that's coming up in a couple months.
All right, so good afternoon, welcome. My name is Jeff Hawkins. I'm very proud to be the Executive Director of Secondary Education for our system. I really appreciate you taking the time. One, I would remind you that the issues we're addressing with you are the issues that kind of rose to the top of that thought exchange. Some of the ones that I'll talk with you are about block scheduling and use of time. Before I get into that, I just want to commend Dr. Jones. He is a very courageous leader. That was a wonderful conversation. Not necessarily easy conversations to bring about. He did it gracefully, and I'm proud to call him a colleague. He just did a great job, and I was really pleased with our conversation. That was awesome. Okay, block scheduling, use of time. There were maybe, of the 39 comments we got, I bet there were 7 or 8 of them on the concept of block scheduling. It was a reoccurring theme. And so I want to talk with you a little bit about some conversations that I'm having with our secondary administrative team. All right. What you see up here is some snippets of what would widely considered to be one of the preeminent pieces of research on the use of time in secondary schools. It's from the Hanover Research Company. It was published in 2014, and one of the things that I would want to point out, one of the very key findings is that top one, and that is there is, at least as of 2014, when this research report was published, there was not, and I'm not aware of anything since then, that identifies a correlation between secondary scheduling models and student achievement. In other words, that report goes, I gave you their key findings bulleted here. I'm happy to share the report more broadly if people would like to see it. But the report goes on to simply state that whether you use time in 45-minute periods, 50-minute periods, 90-minute periods, a varied variety of those, how you use time is probably, as far as the structure is concerned, little compared to the alignment of how we use time with our purpose. So knowing what it is we want to prioritize, knowing what it is we want to accomplish, professionally developing our staff to use time for such purpose, and then selecting time schedules that align to those purposes is what the research would support is key in how we use time. So a lot of the comments were, how are we going to evaluate the effectiveness of block scheduling? Why did we go to block scheduling? And again, being new to my role, knowing that there's new administration at the high school, we're going to need to have some conversations about what was the intended purpose of going to block scheduling, and are we getting from that what we want, knowing that there isn't a research base that would suggest making a change is going to make a difference. It's the alignment of our intentionality to the use of time that's going to make a difference. The next slide really kind of highlights that. Again, that Hanover Research Report reads, the ideal scheduling model for a particular district or school largely depends on which schedule matches the district or school's priorities with respect to scheduling flexibility. In other words, how do we intentionally create flexibility for students with our use of time? While there were some questions specific to what are we going to do in the future, I would really want to engage our high school administration in that conversation about purpose and alignment rather than, so I don't have a specific answer for you today other than we're going to be aware of the research and we're going to be intentional in the way we use time. Another topic that kind of came to the forefront is the therapeutic learning classroom. Some brief updates there that I would want our community to know is that we have partnered with, oh gosh, I had it at the bottom of my slide. It's Dr. Warren Phillips. He's a professor at Iowa State. I believe it's thank you, Central Iowa Psychological Services. And so we have a licensed therapist coming into the high school specific to that classroom, obviously with good communication, parent permission, all that kind of stuff. Multiple times per week. We also have contracted so that that person is available more generally to the building as well to serve in a consultancy role, like a teacher can come to them and say, hey, I'm working with this student, I see these barriers, what are some strategies I could be using in my classroom for general improvement? It might not be that that child themselves needs psychological services, but they just are looking for some consultative help. And so I'm excited to have the partnership and to see how that impacts practices in the building. That's a partnership that's probably begun within the last 2 months. I know that in introducing that, we've had some other folks at middle school and even our elementary school family advocates that have said, how do we get access to that too? So there's a desire on some of our staff to see that expand beyond the high school. But the therapeutic learning classroom in the high school was one specific topic, and I wanted to give you that update as far as that classroom is concerned. One other topic that raised to that level was ELP and acceleration. And I really appreciated Dr. Jones' entry to this because what he described, asking the tough questions, who is not benefiting from our current practice? Who is not benefiting from our current policy around ELP and acceleration is a question that is being asked by, so I've got a committee working on ELP and what does ELP programming and service look like, and how does that align to our practices for qualification, if you will, into that program, as well as acceleration. And when we talk about acceleration, what I believe I've learned is mostly that relates around mathematics, and that mostly happens at the middle school level in our system. There are some ways to accelerate when we get to that high school level by credit for testing out of a class, but when we talk about accelerating at a pace beyond where your grade level is, that's really a mathematics conversation that happens primarily, I believe, at the middle school. At least, again, I'm still in a little bit of learning as I'm new to the system. And again, those are perfect topics to be asking the question, who is not benefiting from our current practice? And so, again, I've got committees working on both who are examining current practice, current policy, and really trying to approach this with an equity lens. I would hearken back to the equity audits that we have shared with our board and with our public that tell us our students of color are not enrolling in our upper level AP classes anywhere near the same as our white students. Same would be true for our students who would be of a free and reduced lunch status and socioeconomic status, right? And so asking those questions, who's not benefiting, is a slow but right process for us to do. As we were doing some reading, particularly about math acceleration with one of these committees the other day, and I have next for you a slide. I want to do a read aloud of this slide and when we talk about math acceleration, I want to emphasize how important that concept is for our learners and for our community. All right, so this Burris, 2004 was the article. It actually references a little bit older, a 1999 study by the U.S. Department of Education. But this article reads, studying advanced math in high school has an enormous influence on whether or not a student subsequently enrolls in a four-year college and earns a bachelor's degree. A U.S. Department of Education study found that taking advanced math in high school was more strongly associated with successful completion of college than any other factor, including high school grade point average and socioeconomic status. And if you know the research around educational outcomes, particularly success after high school, to have something that is a higher influence than socioeconomic status is pretty significant. And so having that slow but thorough and right conversation around how do we approach acceleration and how do we approach ELP services is a really important conversation so that we make sure that we're getting the best that we can for as broad of a net as we possibly can for our students.
Good afternoon. I'm Chad Dumas, Executive Director of Elementary Education, Jeff's colleague, and Superintendent Reisner's and Anthony's. So two topics that came up on the thought exchange that I'll be addressing. One is with future enrollment, and the other is on equity between elementary schools. So in terms of future enrollment, the district has commissioned a study by demographers who professionally are hired to look at where might a district expect trends to be with student enrollment. And they project out 5 years with pretty good accuracy, even 10 years with a little less accuracy. So we're actually in the process of, or they're in the process of creating that study for us, and that'll be shared with us later this month. And then once we have that, then we'll be able to have really solid estimates to predict our future enrollments for our classes going forward. So we're really excited about that. Looking forward to have some really good hard data to give us information to be able to make decisions earlier, communicate earlier, et cetera. In terms of educational equity at the elementary schools, the question was asked about how do you make sure that, in my words, there aren't haves and have-nots between schools. And as I was thinking about this, and we talked about this yesterday as we were looking at the responses from the thought exchange, this really is the challenge of any system and any school, right? You go to Des Moines, you go to Minneapolis, you go to Chicago, and the challenge is reducing variance between buildings. And I say at a school level because the challenge is reducing variance between teachers, right? Because we don't want Angel to be in the classroom with teacher A getting a far better or worse educational experience than teacher B or teacher C. And so we want to make, this is the challenge of our work. At a systems level, it's thinking, how do we reduce variance between our buildings? And so this is our challenge. And so some of the things that are on the docket that we've been working on and will be working on are things like making sure that we have common materials, curriculum materials. So this year we implemented reading units of study for the first time, having some core reading materials in all the classrooms across the district. A couple of years ago, and continuing this year at the elementary level as well, foundations, having some instructional, that's a combination of materials and instructional approaches, right? Some direct, explicit instruction approaches that go along with the use of those materials. The PBIS, an academic or a behavioral side, so reading units of study and foundations are academic. On a behavioral side, in implementing some behavioral expectations across the district. So having these common curriculum type materials, we're anticipating looking at an instructional framework down the road. So we can have a common language of what do we mean by instruction? Any profession that one goes into, there's a language, right? A legal language. Those old television shows with the, Your Honor, this and that, there's a language around being a lawyer. in the medical profession, there's a language around being a medical professional, a doctor or a nurse. In the education profession, we have a language as well, but we haven't agreed on it very well consistently across the country or world. And so in this district, we are going to be identifying an instructional framework that will create this common language so we can have that, those common expectations, conversations, and then a way to get better at what we're doing. So those are a few of the ways that we're working to address this educational equity, not only across buildings, but also between teachers.
I now realize I don't have a question slide in our presentation. So, well, one, thanks again for coming, but those were the thoughts that came to us through our thought exchange. And the really interesting thing about that program is that we can really see and crowdsource what our community wants to talk about, but then everyone also has the opportunity to rate those thoughts. And so we see some that, can move up and down accordingly. But at this point, we want to open it up for any questions that you may have. Yes?
Just a couple things really quick that came to mind as each person was talking. I also want to point out that this summer, I think we were hoping for spring, but it's looking more like summer. We will do the deep dive equity audits on all of our elementaries as well. So we did the middle school and the high school this fall, and they've been so impactful that we want to make sure before we start the next school year, we have the elementary ones done as well. So those will happen this summer. And then there was one other point that I was going to make. That might have been the only one that was, the other thing around we have been talking as a district about the need to have a long-range strategic plan. So it's been a long time, I think, since the district has had one. At least as far back as I can find, there hasn't been one. And so I've been talking with the board throughout the year about our need to have this strategic plan that wraps in transportation, that wraps in facilities, that wraps in the educational piece. And so we have been looking at different models because we want to have the very best model. So that will begin this summer into next fall. We are going to a training, or I guess it's more than a training, it's kind of the initial phases where they look at doing our strategic plan through an equity lens. So making sure that all of our practices and what we set up doesn't just benefit one group of students, but really our practices are equitable throughout. So it's really interesting when you begin to look at transportation or food services or buildings or whatever it is, and you look through an equity lens on top of that strategic planning process. I think it will be really valuable, and I think it's an area that's not done enough of across the nation, so we'll be kind of on that cutting edge, and I am excited about that process and where it will lead us. So I think those were the two, and then, I was thinking you have the evening session, so you can put your question slide in. That's the beauty of it. We get to do this twice.
So I will walk around with the mic if you do have questions, just so that we can get it recorded for the video as well.
If you don't have questions, I have others.
There's a lot of exciting and great things I see happening, which is awesome. One of the questions I have when Dr. Jones was talking about equity updates, we're focusing a lot on race and racism, which we need to. But I've not heard a focus on students with learning disabilities that are persistently bullied, especially in the middle school, with ADD, ADHD, autism, dyslexia, Asperger's, and such. Do you, Dr. Jones, see these children, the students, fitting into the equity umbrella in the school district? And if so, how? What are your plans for that as well? Thank you.
It's a really great question, Karen. And, you know, we've talked a number of times about when I was first at Fellows, I was at the PTO meeting and we walked out together at the end of it, and we talked about the different issues within our school system, even when we were at Fellows. One of the things, again, like I said when I was speaking earlier, that it's going to take all of us to be able to recognize those inequities. Working with our special education department, working with our administrators at the middle school, working with our administrators at the elementary level to be able to provide support for students who have been identified with those particular issues. But what I found, even in my research and even when looking at data, is not to ignore those students who are struggling academically or struggling in our school system to be supported. But we know that we are responding to the data that we have received through the equity audit. I know we partnered a lot with a lot of the dyslexia family support group, and we've received a lot of support and training through them, invitations to trainings that's been hosted in Des Moines or Ankeny. And so we're going to continue to work with those families. We're going to continue to work with our administrators, our special education department to be able to provide support for those families. But when we think about equity, and again, a lot of people do think equity is synonymous with race. Again, I mean, you can look at it historically. When we look and break down data, even with students with disability, race is still a factor. And so when we begin to be comfortable being uncomfortable talking about race, then we can deal with issues as far as students with Asperger's, students who have been identified with autism or whatever that student with disability, whatever that disability that student may have. But what we're focusing on right now, of course, is we're responding to the data, so that doesn't mean that we are ignoring the other things that has been happening. I've been in the district for a while, and I know that there have been groups that have advocated for fine arts programs, families who have advocated for extracurricular activities such as choir, such as the pool support group. But in the past 3 years, this is the first time that I've seen parents, community members come forward to advocate for students of color. And so I boldly say, you know, I know that is our focus right now, but as I look through research, as I look and see what other districts are doing, not only in the state of Iowa, but also across our nation, when we really begin to drill down and be comfortable talking about race and dealing with the issues and inequities in our school system with students who don't look like the majority, then they have a better lens to see the needs of other students. And so those are some of the things that I know that we're having a discussion around.
Is it okay if I follow up on that? Or you
Absolutely.
switch into a different?
No, it's the same topic.
Okay. Do you want? I was just going to say a couple more things. One of the interesting things that I am reading about right now is the conversion, or when students present multiple areas that could be barriers to learning. So students of color have a much higher rate for special education referrals. Students of, this doesn't sound very loud, but students of, that's okay. Anthony sounded louder, but I think he's like, all right, they're up against it, so that might be why. So there's that to look at as well and continue to collect data on. And there's also, in our district, I can speak to this, we have a growing number of students who are experiencing poverty, and the data is showing us within that group, they are very much underperforming. And so there's an area where you begin to look at the convergency of where are where are the students of color within that group? What's the percentage that makes up that group? And then you can really start to target practices to certain areas. So lots of experience I have in dealing with students experiencing poverty and special education, and how those impact then race issues as well. So I think that we're at the initial phases of looking at those, but by all means, you're absolutely right. We have to look at that. Unfortunately, we do have a large number of students being referred for special education, especially in the area of behavior. And that's concerning to us because it's kind of this perception versus maybe a reality of what that really looks like. So we're working through those things, and we'll continue to collect data on that. So I appreciate that question a lot. And it's something that I think about very often. The other thing, I'm sorry, I know I get excited, but the other thing also that we're doing is researching social emotional learning programs. As we talk about our MTSS model, which is the multi-tiered system of support that we haven't had defined as a district, Dr. Dumas talked about that common curriculum so that we can ensure that there's equitable practices throughout our district. That's one of the pieces of that MTSS model is your social emotional learning curriculum. And so that too is an area where we will be able to address some of those bullying and those things that you're talking about. And then the other piece of that is the behavior portion of that multi-tiered system of support, and we spent last deep dive session on that. Knowing that when you begin implementation takes time. There's something called, and I don't want to insult anyone's intelligence, but there's this whole body of research that's called implementation science. And it goes through and really looks at the processes involved in, one, shifting mindset, and two, getting to a place down the road where you're at full implementation. And so you will see, as we move through, you'll see buildings that are at different phases of implementation, and that's because we're human. And the way we receive information and the way information is presented looks different and sounds different to a lot of different humans. So I'm not saying one way is right, one way is wrong, but I'm saying at the end of the road, there has to be common expectations and there has to be accountability. And so you move through the process knowing here's where our outcome or our benchmark is at the end of the year, and where are we in relation to that? So I'm sorry, that kind of went off a little bit, but.
Thank you. The other part of that question was that a lot of the kids that do have learning disabilities may not be in special education because they're not disabled enough to receive those services, and they may not need those services either. So in the general classrooms. So that leads into the second part of my question, which is, can we as a district commit to train our educators on how to work with and educate our students that have dyslexia, that have ADD, ADHD? Because 3 years ago, and you know this, Anthony, we wouldn't use the D word, dyslexia, in this district. So now that we're out of the closet, can we train our teachers?
Yes, and so thank you for asking that as well, because that leads right into this idea of an instructional framework, because when there is a clear instructional framework, it defines what good teaching looks like. And without that, we're guessing what good teaching looks like. We're looking at what we believe as teachers good teaching looks like. And I'm here to tell you, college training programs for teachers look much different. And the skills that our new teachers come out with look much different. And so without that training that you're talking about, which I call differentiation, then it's really difficult. And so what I have seen in this district is that we have taken kind of this attitude of that's someone else's problem. So I'm going to send kids that are struggling with language barrier, I'm going to send those to a different teacher, and they're going to get stuff from that teacher, and I'm not going to do it in the classroom. Special education students, I'm going to send those kids to a different teacher because they're going to teach them. And EL students, they're going to be pulled out and sent to a different teacher so that they can be taught. And highly capable students, or our, what do we call it here, ELP students, they're going to go out of the room to a different teacher. So as you look at those programs, every single one of them is a pull-out program. There has been no common expectation that we teach kids. We don't teach subjects, we teach kids. And every kid comes to us with a different, unique personality and skill set. And we should honor and value that and get excited about the work that we get to do, and not say, we're going to send that kid out and because what happens is what we've seen. A lot of behavior issues because kids aren't learning together. A lot of issues with bullying because, hey, guess what? I get pulled out for ELP, you get pulled out to go to the special ed room. So this can be predicted. You can look at history, you can look at educational data and research, and this is exactly what you're going to see when you have those programs. The exciting part is we get an opportunity to change that. So we get to get an instructional framework and expect that we're going to learn this and we're going to become really solid in differentiation and teaching the whole child and not just sending them out. And once we begin doing that, I think it will help a lot, Karen, with what you're talking about. Long answer, sir.
I just want to follow up on Karen's questions in that context that you were talking about, Superintendent Reisner. When we're looking at instructional framework and we're putting that into place so that we can eliminate some of that bullying, how are we going to handle the kids who already have and have continued to endure? Because that framework, it's a hurry up and wait. So what is the district going to do to ensure that social emotional piece? And again, I can speak just with my own son experience. I mean, this is not something that goes away. This is something he lives with. And so all the other kiddos that have experienced this, where do we go with that? How do we be proactive while we're still waiting for this instructional framework to be in place?
Okay, am I on? Great question. So that is the difficulty of every system, but I think that what we're doing here is front loading, and that's what we need to look at. So we've taken our counselors out of the teaching rotation so that they're available to address some of the issues and do some restorative groups with students. That's number one. The second piece, we've hired behavior interventionists for every building and may need to expand that to deal with some of the disruptive behaviors. But I think the key is that social emotional learning program that's missing. And so that will be implemented in the fall of next year. Fingers crossed that everything works that way, but that too will help. I think my answer really is that we're trying to provide additional support at the building levels and more support. If we can get mental health counselors in by next year, if we'll do that. If we can, so it's yes, beginning to grow the system and get that instructional framework while we're kind of on the back end playing cleanup. And so not a great answer, but I'm hopeful that that additional counseling time is where it's at, because that's where you got to do those restorative circles and start talking to kids. And so I know that's not a great answer and it doesn't help a ton as a parent, but that's where we're at right now.
Just add to that all the work that we're doing, whether it's instructional framework or the reading units of study or any of the PBIS, none of these are silver bullets. None of them take care of every single issue that will arise, or that does arise. What we are intending to do is to create systems so that, if you've seen the pyramid before, so that our systems are in place where core tier 1 instruction, whether it's around the social emotional learning, around academics, around behavior, where through our core instruction in the classroom, 80 to 90% of kids are successful and mastery. And then there's always going to be that 10 to 15% who are going to need additional level of support. And so that's where your tier 2 comes in. And so that's where things like the counselors working with these kiddos, behavior interventionists possibly at that level, social workers, et cetera. And then, like it or not, there will always be 1 to 5% of the kiddos who are going to need really intensive support. And that's where for sure your behavior interventionists come in. Counselors still, licensed mental health practitioners and partnering with outside organizations, et cetera. So none of these things that we're talking about, I just don't want to leave people thinking that, oh, these things are going to solve all the problems. No, what they're intended to do is create systems to reduce the frequency and intensity of the issues that arise and have systems in place to address the needs of kids as they arise.
Just to add on to that, so what school improvement literature would tell us is that as we add systems and move maybe away from putting out a fire, 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 but we have systems that where lots of those fires don't exist, our resources, like counselors and behavior strategists and administrators, will be better able to put out those lesser fires because we have a system where we don't have as many, right? So, but I know that that's also a weight. But I would also want you to hear as parents and community members that as we work at this level to put systems in place, please, if there's issues going on with your kids, reach out to, I was a building principal for years and years and years. The last thing I want is any kiddo that's coming to my building to be having a rough day because of another kid or a teacher. Like, tell, and I'm positively presuming you have, right? And if that level of problem solving doesn't work, then let us know so we can help problem solve, because we want for your kids the same thing you do. We want them to enjoy coming to school and feel great about their experience and have a ton of success. And so we know that right now our system is a lot of fires. And so there's going to be a lot of time spent working with those. But we want to know about them, and we want to ensure that your children have great experiences, and we also want to put systems in place so that our resources can work the way they're intended to.
Okay, so that strikes another personal chord, and that I appreciate, but at what level, as a parent and other parents, when we continue to share and we continue to share and nothing is changing, then we have, as a district, then I'm asking that it's not just, it's all these fires, but it's got to start and stop somewhere. And so how are we being accountable with fidelity and continuing to say, okay, I understand PBIS is going to take its time to roll out. I understand social emotional piece is going to roll its out. But we've been at this for 1.5 years, and we're not seeing anything in our building. And so again, it's just trying to understand how many more levels do my husband and I have to continue to email to say, hey, by the way, this is happening. What else can we do? Let's not fix our son. Let's try and address the situation as a whole so that everybody can benefit from that. So I just feel like what you're saying makes sense, and it's great, and I appreciate you wanting to know that. But again, just personal experiences within our building, I've hit every level possible, and we're still waiting.
So I think the one thing I would, and Amy, you know how much I respect you. I think the one thing I'd push back on is that I would argue that nothing changes in the building. I can remember emails from last year about crossing guards, and I worked all summer long on ensuring that we made every one of our buildings had crossing guards on a daily basis. And so I recognize sometimes that, yep, things have changed, and there are changes that are made, and I think when you're in the midst, it's hard to see or know where you were before, but I would argue that there's additional counseling support so that students are, a lot more students are being seen by counselors. I know that. Across the district, so because I have those numbers. And so be careful saying nothing has been done, because that can feel pretty icky, like, oh, okay, then crossing guards weren't a big deal. I felt like they were a big deal, but maybe they weren't a big deal, and maybe my time was focused on something it shouldn't have been. So just know that that we do hear, and I'm trying to address those issues, and sometimes you can't see it, but you can see it in the long run. But I know that there's bullying things that are going on, and that has to be dealt with. And so we'll make sure that gets dealt with. And not just, I'm not saying your child, I'm saying in general. I know what building you're speaking of, and so I know the challenges that are going on, and I know that something's not working, and we need to address that. And so I want you to know when you leave here today that I'm committed to that, and I hope that my actions in the past have shown that when things reach me, I'm committed to making it right. Can I do that overnight? No. Are there unique issues? Yes, but I can definitely continue to push, and I'm sorry if it doesn't feel like that's been enough. I apologize for that.
I have a question related to the panorama that's going to come out at each school level. Is there going to be a question-answer session at each of the schools with our principals to be able to address the questions, or is it going to need to be done via email, that sort of stuff? So.
Yep, we can talk about that for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can address the secondary. I don't know if it's any different. I don't remember. At the elementary level, so as Superintendent Reisner indicated, no later than January 24th, the results will be sent out. Each building is sending it out the venue that works best for them, whether that's a newsletter or email blast or whatever. But that will go out no later than then. And then in addition to that, there will be opportunities for people to come in and dig in more detail into the data, because that's kind of like a broader look, and then let's dig in together. And so each of the buildings will be doing that. Some are doing it at PTO, some might be doing it as some other separate something or other, but those are all, I don't remember if those are going to be done before January 24th or not, but the release of the data by then, and yes, an absolutely opportunity to come in and dig into it, have conversations around it, and say, okay, so what does this mean for us, and how do we get better based on this data? Yeah.
And to be really transparent, I'd have to apologize. I couldn't speak intelligently right now about what the secondary plan is post January 24th. I'll inquire, and I could get back with a parent on what opportunity there would be. Certainly, we would want to be able to have a conversation, but at this moment, I couldn't tell you whether there's a structured conversation plan in the building or not.
So I work with over 100 families. I volunteer with over 100 families across the district. Most of my families now are in middle school or high school. One of the things that and I see this, but I also been told, is that students are learning from students more and more, and that's the trend that we have going forward. Students are coming into the classrooms to get the work. The teacher will talk, and they seem to learn more from each other, is what I've been hearing from students. So what are we doing to take advantage of that? Because I could see the positiveness of that, students leading each other, students mentoring each other. So what are we as a district doing? Because I see that trend happening, as early as even third grade. Thank you.
So, yeah, that's fine. I will hand this over to you so you can address it as well. So, one, I'm really excited to hear that. There's a lot of, again, literature about pedagogy, like how we instruct, as well as some research around the value of having students work with and collaborate on their learning. It certainly would never intend to take the place as that the teacher is supposed to be that content and pedagogy expert, right? But finding ways to have that teacher facilitate opportunities for students to really process and problem solve and think through with each other is really sound instructional practice, which will then be reiterated through that approach to an instructional framework. So while right now we're hearing anecdotally that it's happening, I think that to me speaks really perfectly to Superintendent Reisner's comment earlier that right now we probably do have a ton of really great instructional practices going on, but it's because that teacher decided that it was, or they got educated on it, or they stumbled upon it, or they, right? It's not because there's been an intentional framework to say, this is what quality instruction looks like, and here's some really quality instructional practices. So in my thinking, as we begin having that common language around instruction and we start standardizing the idea of what does quality instruction look like, and again, we'd want to be really careful about the word I just used, standardizing. There's never an intention with an instructional framework to create instructional robots, like this is what you always do on day one, and this is what you always do, and this is what you always do in this scenario, right? That there's still an art as well as a science to teaching, but an instructional framework recognizes that when there is literature or research around a best practice, like having students confer with each other or confer with the teacher, that we incorporate those practices in. So what we'll see is that as we adopt instructional frameworks, we start to begin standardizing some of those good practices rather than having them be anecdotal examples that happen. I don't know if that's what Jenny would have wanted to reply.
We were doing a little bit of quick planning. So what I really would like is while you leave, I want just some feedback on how helpful this is, if it is helpful, if it isn't helpful. Because we're really trying to communicate differently and better and more, and I think with more frequency. And so if this strategy isn't helpful, we want to know what is. So because it's really important that you're getting the information you need and you have the opportunity to ask us questions. So I think we're going to use our thought exchange tool, and we're going to, we have such a small group that we could kind of talk about this.
I think we go old school for this session.
Oh my gosh. Horrible answer. He's going to really quick. We're going to use thought exchange. So this is exciting because, well, if you have to leave, I understand because lunch could be over, but Eric's going to quickly, no pressure. And we've got time, we can visit. So we're going to create this thought exchange tool, and we'll have you just go onto your phone or whatever you have with you, and then you can give us some feedback. Something to keep in mind as you get these thought exchanges, you're going to get them more frequently. Do you not like them? Is he making faces back there? I know he is. And so, and just to be fair to Eric, I know of many times that he's come in and said, hey, come with me, you need to do this real quick. True, and I've been like, okay, and then I have to go like speak or something, and so he's fine. So this, as you get this tool more and more, know that one, it's anonymous, so we can't see there's no possible way for us to see who sends what. And then the other thing, it's supposed to filter bad words and things, and we noticed that a bad word came through and it didn't filter it, so we're working on that to get that solved. So, and names, we try not to use names, and if we see specific names being used, like, superintendent, that's different, but a teacher's name or, somebody's name, that's supposed to get filtered out as well, and it didn't on this last one. So for that, we apologize, and I know Eric's working on making sure that doesn't happen. Good, he's doing great. Any other questions? Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit more to teacher retention?
Yep, that was quick, wasn't it?
And
Yep.
I think the exit interview piece is
It sure does, yes. Yep. So we've ramped up our onboarding process. We have Vonda Junk leads that process, and this year we did some new. Well, it was last year. I think we did some new pieces to that. All of our teachers get mentors. However, I'm not sure it's our new teachers that we're not keeping, and so we're hopeful that the data that we're going to be collecting from the teachers on exit interviews will help us identify some of the areas. In addition to that, the survey, this Panorama survey, has given us a lot of good information. What I can tell you is the lowest area that teachers have identified, so that area on Panorama that is just like really, really low, they've identified that they don't get regular feedback from their evaluator. And anybody who doesn't get regular feedback from an evaluator, that's tough. We all know that. So that's number one, first and foremost, is that feedback from their evaluator, and I can't remember the wording on it, but an evaluation process that's, what was the wording on that? It's not coming to me. It was all around evaluation.
Feedback and or evaluation. It was what was reflected in the Panorama results that Superintendent Reisner is talking about is the sentiment that both feedback and coaching, either informal or formal through an evaluation process, are useful and helpful to help the teacher grow. And so I would agree wholeheartedly, starting from the way we onboard and mentor, throughout the process of how we help people feel that they grow and become better, right? A lot of the research around what's satisfying to an adult to stay in a job is growth, right? The feeling that I'm making a difference and getting better at what I do. As well as, I would say, I personally think one thing that we can do to help is to share our data, right? So I know we get accolades as a system, maybe some of those broad accolades like US News and World Report or niche or whatever, but showing data where we're making an impact on student growth is also aligning to research on adult theory on why people stay in jobs, and then of course with the exit interviews as well.
And so I think that's too, we've heard teachers say clear expectations, and I do listen and learns in each building. I do them, I've only been able to do them once a year, but that's where I go to every building, and I give each teacher 15 minutes to meet with me and talk about what their challenges are and what things are going well for them. One thing that I've heard over and over and over is we'll do it if we understand and the expectations are there, and so that's something we're going to be working on through the process of our instructional framework, and then eventually a more robust evaluation system, which sounds like, oh, we're the teachers, we're making them comply with this robust evaluation. They actually want it, because then your expectations are clear and you're getting feedback. So I think those are some of the things that, and hopefully that was an answer to that. But okay, Eric's got.
We did
Let's
it.
all give Eric
we
a
did
hand.
It. Yay.
Oh, you got one.
I got it,
Yes.
Mike. Yes. So you can, if you have on your phone, if you have an iPhone, you can just open up your camera, and it'll ask you to open this up in Safari. If you have an Android, I think you need a QR code reader, but you can just point it up to it. It will ask you to open up the website, and then you can share your thoughts through Thought Exchange anonymously, as well as rate the thoughts of others.
And so, yeah, that's the cool part. You can rate others, which I'm sure they already know that.
It's very awesome. We did it.
I do live in 1990 and my 11-year-old's not here. I already tried the QR Siri right here.
Did anybody have trouble with it? If they did, let me know.
So I find
Can you post the website or something? Is that possible? I had the QR Siri, but I just didn't know if it was too
Maybe.
far away.
And what's important is to hear, I want to hear from the people here.
You want to do it on my phone?
So that's why I don't want to post it.
It's anonymous, so it's not.
Again, I don't. Okay.
So I think at this point, we'll wrap up the video part of it, and we'll continue to do this part, yes, through the thought exchange. So thank you again for coming.
So much.